this talk. Okay, and we will continue.
Sorry about that.
No worries at all. Okay, so what I would like to do in our time together is to provide you with an update on recent advances in Alzheimer's research. You'll see AD as the short form for Alzheimer's. I hope that won't bother anybody. The dermatologists don't like that because they say, no, that's atopic dermatitis. But I think we can tell them otherwise. And I want to discuss what the impact of anticipated breakthroughs, because we will have treatment breakthroughs, and what will the impact be on our healthcare system? Will we be ready and prepared or not? And also to offer a call to action to those of you who may be interested in joining us in this march we have to end Alzheimer's. We need to get rid of this bad disease. So let's start with diagnosis. Before we get to aducanumab, we need to think about how Alzheimer's disease was diagnosed and is being diagnosed now. And the story started in 1906 when this German neurologist and psychiatrist, Dr. Alwa Alzheimer, described a first patient with memory problems. Her name was Auguste Dieter. She was a German housewife. She was in her 40s when she developed memory problems. They were progressive. He followed her in her 50s, and at age 55 she died, and he autopsied her brain. He described a disease he thought was rare, and it was later named after him, Alzheimer's disease. And we know, if we fast forward to today, 2020, this is a pandemic. Not trying to compete with the COVID-19 pandemic, but that pandemic, the viral pandemic, will come and go. It seems like it's taking forever, but it won't be with us forever. However, Alzheimer's disease will continue to be a major global challenge until we do something more definitive about it. And here you see some of the well-known actors, celebrities, politicians who succumb to Alzheimer's disease later in life. But even younger people can develop Alzheimer's disease. And here on your left, you see John Mann, who died at age 52 of Alzheimer's disease just a couple of years ago. He was the front man for the folk rock band Spirit of the West in Canada. And Julianne Moore on your right, who played Alice in the movie Still Alice. She was the Harvard linguist who developed Alzheimer's disease symptoms at the age of 50. So 8% of people are under the age of 65 when they develop Alzheimer's disease. So the World Health Organization declared Alzheimer's disease an urgent healthcare priority way back in 2012. So 10 years ago, not just because of the staggering numbers of people affected, but because of the severity of the disease, severe morbidity and severe vulnerability of people with this disease, the enormous cost of care, which is more than heart disease and cancer combined. Most people don't realize that. And the disease, despite being common, is fraught with underdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and late diagnosis, with only about 50% of people ever being told or diagnosed with Alzheimer's who actually have it. And those who are diagnosed receive the diagnosis after several years of symptoms, sometimes only when there is a crisis that emerges. And why is this? Why is a common disease so hard to diagnose? Well, quite a few reasons. Patients may not recognize that they have the disease, and this is not denial in the psychiatric sense. This is a failure of the part of the brain that lets us judge how we're doing to actually function. And so even in the face of being very forgetful, someone might think there's nothing wrong and therefore not seek out medical help. Someone has a headache, we go to the doctor. When you don't realize your memory's not working, you don't seek any help. And then there are those with Alzheimer's disease who are aware that something's changing and it's scary, and they're afraid of stigma, afraid of losing a driver's license or other losses of independence, and so they don't come forward. When people do see their doctor, physicians may not be very well versed in how to diagnose, and often, unfortunately, lack interest because they feel they have not enough to offer patients, and so they kind of avoid Alzheimer's disease, which is very sad, because we owe it to people to clarify what their symptoms are all about and see what we can do. Symptoms can easily be confused with normal aging, especially early on when symptoms are subtle. And our cognitive tests may be insensitive, especially at the earliest stages. But what we know for sure now is that this is a very long disease. Alzheimer's disease has about a 20-year period where changes in the brain are going on and there may be no symptoms at all. And on testing, nothing to find. So we call this the preclinical or pre-symptomatic stage. But gradually, as brain cells are being injured, and I'll show you what injures brain cells in a moment, we then progress to the MCI or mild cognitive impairment stage and stay there for about 5 years. At the MCI stage, people are still functioning. They may be working, driving, shopping, banking, doing all the things that they would normally do, but there is a memory impairment or some other cognitive impairment that they notice and that we can pick up on testing, and yet it's not enough to take away from their independence. They're able to compensate. Once one can no longer do things completely independently, we enter the dementia stage of Alzheimer's disease, and that lasts about 10 years. And it's usually broken down into mild, moderate, and severe stage disease. So you can see how long this disease is. And if someone's diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease dementia in their 70s, they were probably developing this disease in their 50s. So, we think, oh, that's pretty scary. I have no symptoms. Maybe I have Alzheimer's. Well, it's scary, but if you flip it around and think this is a huge window of opportunity, if we can detect this disease before it is impairing us in any way, and if we can intervene, that's what we need to do. That would be prevention-minded strategy. And what goes on through this whole disease, even before symptoms, is that amyloid accumulates in the brain, and amyloid is a sticky protein in this microscopic view of the brain. This would be at autopsy or brain biopsy. We don't usually biopsy the brain. So at autopsy, we would see these smudgy brown plaques made up of amyloid. And once enough amyloid has accumulated and has injured brain, then tau, another sticky protein, starts accumulating and also damaging brain. And tau is represented as these little dark dashed areas. Ultimately, over many years, the brain shrinks and millions of brain cells are lost. So you can see the difference in size between someone whose brain was autopsied, who died of Alzheimer's, and someone who had a normal brain. And millions, I can't emphasize enough, millions of brain cells are lost. So treating late is absolutely not going to be the path forward. We need to protect brain cells from dying. And now we can, I'm happy to say, make a diagnosis in life and early in the disease. And we have the tools to do this. We've had these for about 10 years now. PET scans that have the use of an amyloid tracer can actually see amyloid in the living brain and early in the disease. And spinal fluid collected by a spinal tap can do the same thing. And this is so important because this means Alzheimer's disease is not just a disease that you can only be sure about at autopsy. And it's not just a matter of ruling out other diseases. In medicine, we talk about diagnoses of exclusion where we don't have a way to diagnose for sure. So we rule out strokes and tumors or rule out other possibilities. And if we don't find those, we say, well, I guess it's probably Alzheimer's, but we're never sure. So that's just not true anymore. We can be clear, we can be definite. And once we can make a definite diagnosis, that opens the way to better and better therapies. Can you imagine trying to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 if we couldn't identify and diagnose that virus? And the same with different types of cancers. You have to be able to diagnose them accurately in order to develop specific therapies. And people do better the earlier we can treat. So this is the whole goal. And here's an example of a PET scan showing amyloid in the brain. And on the right, you see the image of the brain from the person who's in the PET scanner. The red area is amyloid. So there's lots of amyloid in this person's brain. And yet the amount of amyloid doesn't tell us the stage of disease. This person may have no symptoms, or they may be at an advanced stage of Alzheimer's disease dementia. What this amyloid PET scan shows us is that Alzheimer's disease is going on in the brain. That is the diagnosis. And then the stage will depend on whether the person has symptoms, whether they're independent in daily activities, and in the future on other biomarkers, not just clinical symptoms. Spinal tap, we do these almost daily in our clinic, a very well-tolerated procedure. Some people are fearful, and it's more a cultural thing. Isn't that dangerous to do a spinal tap? Well, actually, no. There are a small percentage of people who would not be amenable, people who have spinal disease or deformities or severe arthritis of the lower back, or people who are on anticoagulants. Other than that, spinal tap is a very reasonable way to collect fluid, and that fluid can be measured for amyloid and tau. So why isn't this happening more often? In our clinic, we are aiming to be very clear about diagnosis and then offer treatment opportunities. But PET scans are expensive and they're not yet covered by OHIP. That will change once we have a first disease-modifying drug available. And right now, the number of PET scanners we have, the actual machines across Canada, are limited in number. And most of the scan time is devoted to cancer medicine. And I certainly do not begrudge our cancer patients of their needed scans, but we absolutely have to expand the time on the scanner to include people with memory problems so that they can also get clear diagnoses. As far as spinal fluid analysis, I did mention a few groups of patients for whom this would not be a good procedure, those on blood thinners or those with spinal disease, but the majority of people could have a spinal tap, and we do it readily. But at the moment, we don't have a Canadian lab that processes the spinal fluid. We have labs that will process for bacterial infection, bacterial meningitis, or glucose protein, but not for the biomarkers of Alzheimer's, not for amyloid and tau. So we're sending spinal fluid to a lab in Amsterdam. Go figure. That will change also. So stay hopeful, because we need to have a Canadian lab to send our biospecimens. And in the future, and it is the near future that I'm talking about, the next few years, we will have blood tests to predict the level of amyloid in the brain, if not to diagnose Alzheimer's. So the initial blood tests are sort of pre-screeners, and they give an estimate of the likelihood of a PET amyloid scan being positive or spinal fluid showing amyloid. But more blood tests are coming, and as I said, in the next couple of years, we may have some very specific, useful blood tests, which will make diagnosing less expensive, will allow family practitioners and other medical practitioners to be involved, so it's not just a matter of waiting for a specialist appointment, and markers also that will help with staging disease. So this will become a very interesting endeavor. And finally, retinal scans are a very realistic possibility for detecting Alzheimer's disease early, and we are partnering with a company called ReadySpec to try and develop a retinal scan. The back of the eye is the front of the brain, and so the amyloid accumulating in the brain can actually be seen by a special camera. It's called a hyperspectral camera that takes a picture of the back of the eye, the retina, and can see the signature of amyloid. So this doesn't require any dye, it's non-invasive. And as I say, the validation studies are going on, and the recent readout for the validation study is actually very good. So we've made a lot of progress in diagnosis. You can see from 1906, we were talking about autopsy, and those of you who are art history buffs, you might notice Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. I just had to throw that in. That was a former career of mine, art history, or a field of study. But in the last 10 years, from the 2010s onwards, we've had PET amyloid tracers. There's actually a tau tracer approved in the US now for clinical use, and we've had an amyloid tracer for several years in Canada, and spinal fluid analysis. And coming up over the next few years, we'll have blood tests and possibly a retinal scan. So the reason I harp on diagnosis is that will be the gateway to treatment, to accelerating treatments, and to rolling out treatments in a specific way. And finally, I'll just mention a few words about genetic testing. We have genetic influence in terms of who develops Alzheimer's disease in two different ways. There are rare gene mutations that can directly cause Alzheimer's disease. These are inherited from one generation to the next. They're often associated with a young age of symptom onset, and we can determine in the appropriate pedigree, if someone has two or more relatives with Alzheimer's disease, or a close relative who had very young age of onset, under the age of 65, of Alzheimer's, then this blood test would be appropriate if one wanted to know if they had inherited a gene that would cause Alzheimer's. The cost is covered in Ontario, and for somebody who might harbor one of these gene mutations, there are clinical trials that are both prevention trials as well as treatment trials if someone is symptomatic. On the other hand, the majority of us do not have these rare gene mutations, but we have a combination of risk genes and I should say protective genes. And that's true for all diseases. But in Alzheimer's disease, the most important risk gene is the ApoE gene. And specifically, it's the ApoE4 type of the ApoE gene that increases risk. Again, we can test this with a blood test or just a simple cheek swab. The cost of the testing is covered, and many people were just blown away at how many people want to know, do they carry this risk gene? They end up taking better care of themselves, enrolling in studies, finding out more information, and there are clinical trial opportunities for people who carry a risk gene. Here's Kathy Barrick. Some of you may know her. She's the CEO of the Alzheimer's Society of Ontario. She approached us and said, I'd like to help research. I want to know if I have a risk gene. She came to our clinic. We did a cheek swab. There you see the tiny little DNA analyzer. It's called the Spartan Cube. It's 4 by 4 inches and sits on the lab countertop. And if someone has 1 copy of ApoE4, the risk of Alzheimer's disease is 3-fold over the general population. 2 copies of ApoE4, 10-fold greater risk. And Kathy wanted to know what her ApoE carrier status was and whether she might be able to participate in research. And she really wanted to lead by example, and I applaud her for that. So great to be able to diagnose and to assess risk, absolutely important in a rather neglected disease where physicians are guilty of not, seizing an opportunity. And sometimes patients and families are too willing to just put memory symptoms down to age alone. But we do need treatments, and things are happening. So the existing medicines we've had for about 20 years, 2 classes of approved medicines. Aricept is the best known. It's in that first class called cholinesterase inhibitors. So donepezil is the generic name. The brand name was Aricept. And these medicines, while we're grateful to have them, they have modest benefit to symptoms only. They don't slow down the progression of amyloid or tau. They don't touch the underlying pathology of the disease, as we would say. And none of them are approved for the mild cognitive impairment stage. So even though we can identify mild cognitive impairment as an early stage, people have to wait till they get worse before they can have one of these approved medicines. So that's just not reasonable. That's not the way early detection should play out. So we are definitely due for a breakthrough, and I'm happy to say it's coming. After many failures in the Alzheimer's drug development pipeline, there is new hope. Drugs and trial designs, so the actual study designs, are much more sophisticated. The investment in Alzheimer's disease research has increased substantially. I don't think it will ever catch up to the investment in cancer medicine or heart disease. However, it has increased substantially, and we need that. And a first disease-modifying drug, and by that I mean a disease-slowing drug, not a drug just to treat symptoms, but to slow down the disease. The first one was approved by the FDA in 2021. And there is that name, Aducanumab. So Karen's going to be an expert at pronouncing this by the end of the talk. So let's talk about Aducanumab. This is an antibody that targets amyloid. So it binds to amyloid in the brain. The antibody gets into the brain. It's given by intravenous infusion. It draws amyloid out of the brain and does so very successfully. This drug received FDA approval for treatment of Alzheimer's disease through a conditional pathway. So the accelerated pathway, based on this drug's impact on a disease biomarker that's thought to inform clinical response. And what I mean by that is the FDA was very taken by how robustly aducanumab could clear amyloid from the brain and felt there was evidence to suggest that clearing amyloid would result in clinical benefit. So the approval was based on the results of a phase 1 study. It was a large phase 1 study, as well as the phase 3 program, which showed substantial clearance of amyloid and some evidence of clinical benefit in both the phase 1 study and one of the 2 phase 3 studies. So it gets a little complicated here, but stay with me. So in 2016, the phase 1 study yielded this on the cover of Nature magazine. Someone who has a head full of amyloid on a PET scan, as you see in the left image, okay, and the same person, after being treated with 12 treatments once monthly of aducanumab, that's the same person, has no amyloid in the brain. This was the first time in 2016 that we had a molecule that could completely clear amyloid plaque. And this was groundbreaking at the time, and it launched the phase 3 program rather than skipping from phase 1 to phase 3 because the findings were so compelling. And in the phase 1 program, not only was amyloid cleared, but there was some evidence that people were doing better, people who were receiving the drug versus people on placebo. So based on that and the phase 3 results, the FDA approved aducanumab last June. And the phase 3 program consisted of 2 18-month studies. These were large global studies. All of the subjects who enrolled had what we call early AD. That means mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia with a PET scan being positive for amyloid. So there was no chance that their mild dementia or their mild cognitive impairment was due to another disease or another condition. So very well-defined population. And one of the 2 studies, called the EMERGE study, showed less decline in cognition, less decline in daily activities, less emergence of psychiatric symptoms, all of that in the treated patients who received the optimal dose, the targeted dose, which was 10 milligrams per kilogram per month. The other study, called the ENGAGE study, had the same protocol. It turned out to be negative in its primary outcome measure, but on further analysis done in conjunction with the FDA, it was felt that these patients were underdosed. And I won't go into the various reasons why, but an insufficient number of patients actually got to the optimal dose, and therefore it was felt that the benefit was not seen because of underdosing in the second study. As far as biomarkers, the phase 3 program in both of the 2 studies, EMERGE and ENGAGE, showed target engagement, very robust clearance of amyloid, but not as much clearance in the second study, which was negative, showing that the amount of amyloid you clear matters in terms of getting a benefit from a clinical standpoint, meaning less decline in cognition and day-to-day function. In addition to showing reduction of amyloid, very interestingly, treatment with aducanumab also showed reduction of tau, which is a downstream change in the brain. So again, going along the sequence that amyloid accumulates and triggers tau to be abnormal and accumulate. And if you can treat amyloid and treat it early enough, you can slow down tau as well. And on further analysis in this study, there was evidence of reduction in what we call neurodegeneration or brain cell loss, brain cell death. So again, the kinds of things you would want to see in a drug that's modifying the disease. And yet aducanumab, as some of you will know, met with a lot of controversy, in part because of its novelty and in part because of its very unusual development pathway. It went from phase 1 to phase 3, as I alluded to. Again, in agreement with the FDA pathway, there was lots of consultation between the manufacturer, Biogen, and the FDA. So it wasn't just that Biogen decided we're not going to bother with phase 2. It seemed justified. Anyway, phase 2 is skipped. There was a pre-planned futility analysis, which is a very common thing in drug development, so that we are assessing or getting an estimate on the likelihood of a trial succeeding if it runs to completion. This is just a projection or estimate, and futility analyses can be wrong. But in the case of the Aducanumab phase 3 program, the futility analysis did not suggest success. And in the end, one of the studies was very positive, very successful, where the other one was not. So it was very complicated. And the approval achieved by the FDA was based on one of the phase 3 studies being positive, despite the fact that the other was not. So you can see how tangled the web is. There was also the issue of the external advisors to the FDA being very negative about the potential benefits, and media negativity that followed. And then additional controversy over the fact that the FDA chose an accelerated pathway approval, which is a conditional approval based on likelihood. This has worked well in cancer medicine, where for a very serious disease indication with a high unmet need, where there's no other therapies, the FDA uses this accelerated pathway so that promising therapies can get into the hands of patients without waiting another 3 to 5 years for more confirmatory trials to be done. It's a conditional approval, which means that, yes, the drug's on the market, but Biogen, the manufacturer, must conduct a post-marketing study to confirm the benefit. Otherwise, the approval could be withdrawn. So you can see how complicated this got. Despite this, Aducanumab is on the market in the US. A regulatory review has been ongoing over the past year, I think since the spring of 2021, to determine whether Health Canada will approve the drug. And we're due probably to hear from Health Canada in the spring. And same with other regulatory jurisdictions as well. So we've really entered a new phase in Alzheimer's disease. Whether or not one is impressed with aducanumab, the fact that this drug was approved really launches a new chapter in our forward momentum for therapeutics. And from the drug development standpoint, there's an increased investment in drug development, more innovation. We saw this right away starting in June last year, and this leads to more rapid advancement of promising therapies. There's a greater emphasis in drug development on the underlying biology, not just treating symptoms, and this will lead to precision medicine. Just the same way we don't treat prostate cancer the same way we treat breast cancer. They are different cancers, and you need to be specific, and you need to understand the underlying biology. And also, once you have a first drug on the market, then you can do head-to-head comparisons. So aducanumab versus another drug under development. It's very hard to do direct comparisons between drugs when you don't have a first drug approved. Same with combination therapies. You know, maybe we need an anti-tau drug along with an anti-amyloid. Now we've got aducanumab approved, at least in the US, and so we could trial that in combination with an anti-tau therapy or an anti-inflammation drug or something else. And in a complex disease like Alzheimer's, we are likely to need combination therapy. Just the way treating diabetes or hypertension, we often use a combination of 2, sometimes 3 drugs. For the real-world patients out there, there's an opportunity on a disease-slowing drug to stay independent longer, to remain at home, to continue to do the things that one values. And also with a drug like aducanumab, one can expect to get clarity with respect to diagnosis, because before a physician can write a prescription for treatment with aducanumab to start in the US, and it will almost certainly be the same in Canada, one would need to have an amyloid test, whether it's a PET scan or spinal tap, or in the future a blood test, to be sure that this is what we're dealing with. And as we diagnose earlier and patients come forward because they're more hopeful, there's less stigma, there's definitely more reason to be hopeful. And for physicians who were rather nihilistic, it's a chance to make a difference. Now it's very hard for a physician to say, well, it doesn't make any difference if I, diagnose Alzheimer's disease or not. Well, yes, it does, because you don't want to miss this disease early when early treatment is available and can matter to people. So this is the first drug, aducanumab, approved for Alzheimer's in over 18 years. Nobody thought it would take so long to get this next drug after the last one in 2003, I think was memantine. Abixa was its brand name. And the first drug to clear amyloid, the underlying toxic protein in this disease. The first drug to treat mild cognitive impairment, not just the dementia stage. And the first drug to be given by intravenous infusion for Alzheimer's disease, putting us on par with other diseases where biologics are quite readily available, whether it's migraine or rheumatoid arthritis or many other diseases where intravenous infusion of biologics are the norm. And it's the first drug, as I said before, to require an amyloid test to confirm the diagnosis. When someone is started on Aricept or donepezil, the physician is generally saying, I think this is Alzheimer's. I'm not sure. Let's try donepezil. But with a drug like aducanumab, we need to be more sure. And this is the first drug also for Alzheimer's to require MRI monitoring. And why is that? Well, it's for safety reasons, because there can be some fluid shifts in the brain with a drug like aducanumab. In fact, all of the antibodies that target amyloid can cause some fluid shifts and some swelling in the brain. This is usually a radiologic finding, meaning it's seen on MRI scan. You can monitor for it, you can hold the dose, you can mitigate against this finding. It's called ARIA. It happens in 35% of people in the aducanumab studies. It was seen in 35% of people. And for the most part, it was without symptoms. But a small proportion of people will have symptoms. When symptoms are there, it's usually transitory, mild, can be headache, can be dizziness, can be confusion, which clears on its own. However, I don't want to say that it is always mild. There have been some rare cases of severe reactions. Within the phase 3 program, there were no deaths. All of the severe reactions and all of the mild reactions cleared on study. However, in the post-marketing world, there has actually been one very severe, there have been a few severe side effects from aducanumab, which include seizures, all self-limiting except for one in a patient in Quebec, and more information is still being gleaned about that. That patient actually died. It's not clear that they died because of aducanumab, but it's a very muddy case, and I'm happy to discuss that at some point if anybody's interested. So there's politics and there's science, and there are a lot of myths around aducanumab, that the drug doesn't work, that patients won't benefit, that it's not safe, that the FDA and Biogen were somehow in cahoots together, and all the results are post hoc, and the drugs will hold back research, and this drug, aducanumab, will divert resources. And really, these are myths. They are not well thought out. Many of them are completely false. And what we see is forward momentum. We see that since the drug was approved and since the first patient in the US received aducanumab, the FDA 1 month later granted breakthrough therapy designation to 2 other drugs, not aducanumab, drugs in the same class, but slightly different, lecanemab and donanemab. In July, the FDA updated its aducanumab indication to specify that it was for early Alzheimer's disease. In July of 2021, a very important paper called the Appropriate Use Criteria was written by Jeff Cummings et al. And this was directed not to the research community, but to practicing clinicians in the US to help them understand how to use a new medicine. We need new guidelines. We will need them in Canada when this class of medicine, whether it's aducanumab or one of the others, comes to the market. We need to update our physicians on how to use this. Trial designs have become more focused on disease biology and proving clinical meaningful results. In the fall of 2021, so just a few months ago, both Eli Lilly and Eisai initiated their rolling submission for approval of lecanemab and donanemab using the accelerated pathway for approval. And so it is quite possible within the next 1 to 2 years, lecanemab and donanemab may be on the market, giving still more choices for patients and physicians for treatment of Alzheimer's. In October, again, just a few months ago, last year, October 2021, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to another molecule, gantenerumab. So now there's 3 of them that are very prominent in the pipeline. And the post-marketing confirmation trial, the confirmatory trial that Biogen is required to roll out, will start in May of 2022. It will be a global trial. It will be open to Canadian participants. It will probably start in the US first, and then hopefully Canadian participants will be invited as well. So a lot going on. And just to mention lecanemab and donanemab in slightly more detail, both of these trials showed very robust lowering of amyloid in their phase 2 programs, which are completed and reported. And those phase 2 programs also showed less decline in patients treated with these drugs, 30% less decline in the case of lecanemab and 32% in donanemab. So the disease was not totally arrested, but people were staying stable much longer. And the phase 3 trials in both cases are fully enrolled now, and results are expected for the lecanemab trial in 2022. So that's later this year in the fall. And for donanemab, which completed its phase 3 enrollment later, it will be the fall of 2023. So later this year and later next year, we'll have the readout of these very prominent drug programs in phase 3. And these phase 3 programs are for people, again, with early symptomatic Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, or mild dementia. But very importantly, prevention trials have just been launched for these compounds. Prevention meaning for people who are at risk for Alzheimer's, but still cognitively normal. And we're really proud to participate in these trials as well. The AHEAD study is the lecanemab study, just started a couple of weeks ago in Canada, and we've already got a big lineup of people who we are screening for this study. The donanemab phase 3 prevention study has also been initiated. And with gantenerumab, this is a little different. This drug is an antibody against amyloid, but it's given by intravenous injection rather than by intravenous infusion. And boy, if this drug crosses the finish line, a lot more convenient. One can have home dosing, one can self-inject the treatment, or a family member could do it rather than having to go to an infusion center and get monthly intravenous infusion. So fingers crossed for gantenerumab as well. And a phase 3 prevention trial, the Skyline trial, will begin this year. Roche, who is the manufacturer for gantenerumab, actually decided they didn't want to start a submission under the accelerated approval pathway. They want to wait to the phase 3 program, which is fully enrolled and will read out this year. They want to see if they have positive clinical results and then go for full approval, not conditional approval. So we've got lots of pots bubbling here, and it is a very exciting time in Alzheimer's disease. Terrible disease, that hasn't changed, but we've never had so many options looking so promising. And it's not all about amyloid. So let's say even if these drugs that I'm talking about don't come to the market, although I would think that some of them will, if not all of them, there are still numerous other disease-modifying treatments that are under study, looking at anti-tau antibodies and other compounds that are not antibodies to reduce tau in the brain. And studies harnessing the immune system. This is very important as well, to activate the immune system to clear amyloid or to boost the protective functions of these support cells in the brain. And here is a diagram of all of the compounds in these little, shapes and colors under development. And you can see phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of drug development. Those that are in red are targeting amyloid, those that are in blue are targeting tau, those that are in yellow are targeting inflammation in the brain, and there are other colors as well. So you can see a very robust pipeline with over 100 compounds and targeting different stages of the disease, from the dementia stage, the mild cognitive impairment, and the preclinical stage. So for symptoms, what's exciting? Well, there's so many things. But I want to emphasize, we still need to treat symptoms, not just slow down disease. We need to improve symptoms. And there is a purified plant extract called GV971, or oligomanate, if you want a tongue twister. GV971 is easier. This was approved in China in 2019. But is being trialed globally now. And again, this is one of the studies that we have to offer people. This is for people with mild or moderate severity Alzheimer's disease dementia who are unable to tolerate or haven't tried or started a cholinesterase inhibitor, the background standard therapy, or tried it and didn't get benefit. This is a derivative of brown algae that reduces inflammation in the brain by altering bacteria in the gut. Very, very interesting mechanism, and very hopeful that this will be a symptomatic treatment moving forward. And prevention trials, I alluded to who's at risk, people who are over age 65 or younger if they have a family history, people who have one or more copies of the ApoE4 gene, or people who've noticed subtle changes in their memory, even if they're cognitively normal. And so screening for a prevention trial allows access, free and easy access, to an amyloid PET scan, so one can tell for sure whether the beginnings of Alzheimer's are going on in the brain or not. And if they are going on, then one can avail oneself not just to an expert team, but to a promising treatment at the earliest stage of the disease in the brain before it's causing symptoms or affecting one's day-to-day function. So the AHEAD study I mentioned goes down as young as age 55, and the Skyline studies with gantenerumab for people aged 60 to 80 years. So advocacy is so important. Having in my career, really advocating for people having the right to a timely diagnosis and expert care. And I've always chosen to practice in the community and to focus on what matters to patients and to give patients a voice in any of the consulting work I do. This is so important to me to enable Canadian patients to access clinical trials. I don't think Canadians should have to go to, to France or to the United States to get state-of-the-art clinical trial access, but also when drugs are approved, we should have them in Canada. And we need to reorganize our healthcare system to do that. So there are challenges rolling out a biologic. We need to enhance, our ability to diagnose. We need Canadian labs. We need more access to PET scans and sustainable funding for Alzheimer's. These are all doable if we raise our voice, and a lot of us are trying to do that. So we need to counter the negativity, educate, collaborate, establish new expert roles. And to me, this is all doable. Other fields of medicine have pivoted to rolling out biologics, and there's no reason why we can't do this in Alzheimer's disease. So we all have a role to play, and I often say, keep your eye on the mission, use your voice, represent those who can't, and people who know this disease absolutely want to help. We need to let politicians know that this disease is important. You can have a baseline memory test we offer, screening memory tests. We are not restricting ourselves to the Toronto or GTA geography. We are open to anyone in Ontario, and we have lots of services. You can join our prevention or treatment registry. You can undergo a free cheek swab to check for AD risk or find out if a clinical trial is right for you. And I speak to you with huge respect for what you do, for your challenges, for the Alzheimer's Society's wonderful initiatives. And I speak out of love for my own family and my own parents, who you see here, who both succumbed to Alzheimer's disease. My dad was a brilliant pianist, concert pianist, and mathematician, and my mother was a linguist and a poet. And nobody survives this disease, but that will change. And my brother and sister and I, just sort of pulling the pieces together as best we can. It was too late for my parents. It's not too late for us. It's not too late for my daughters. And we all need to protect next generations. I really believe we can do this. So please help make a difference. If you feel so inclined, connect with us. This is our email address. You'll have access to Justine Riom, who's on the meeting with us, or her colleagues. You can phone us, and any way we can help you. we're really happy to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for your attention, and I'd love to answer your questions if I can.
Thank you so much. And Justine, I'll let you take care of the Q&A. We do have about 20 questions to get through. So what I'm going to do is stop recording now so that people can ask their questions without worrying about it, and let you have catch your breath a little bit. I was practicing saying the word, but I'm not going to say it now.
Oh, Aducanumab.